I would like to also start things off by offering a land acknowledgement. So UMass Boston is situated on the ancestral homeland of Native peoples, including the Massachusetts, as well as their relatives and neighbors, the tribes of the Nipmuc and Wampanoag, and their descendants. They walked here before us, and they continue to walk here today. We offer a land acknowledgement to honor this land, which was taken by conquest, and to recognize the historical legacy of colonialism, the imposition of white supremacy, and the domination of the people who inhabited this land for generations. We do it to raise greater public consciousness of First Nation sovereignty and cultural rights, and as a small step towards equitable relationship and reconciliation. So, to start us off with our program, I would like to hand things over to David Moy from the Hines Foundation. Go ahead, David.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Thank you all for joining us for this event. I'm sure there's a lot going on as we approach the holiday season, so thank you so much for taking the time to join us. Again, I'm David Moy. I'm here on behalf of the Hines Foundation. And on the behalf of the Hines Foundation, I want to express our appreciation for this opportunity to actually partner with the UMass team, the Sustainability Solutions Lab, and also our colleagues at the Bar Foundation to support this work and getting out this report on the communities that we're very much enmeshed and care about. Specifically, as most would acknowledge and understand, the BIPOC communities, the marginalized communities of this city and greater Boston have faced for a long time disproportionate impacts from environmental pollution and degradation issues. So it should be no surprise that as we face the impact of climate change, that these very same communities are the ones that will bear the disproportionate impact of the change as it speeds along. So the bottom line is that we know this is going to happen. The disproportionate of it is due to the fact that our communities lack the social, economic, and political resources needed to address what is coming. And for that reason, it's important as we begin to remedy that, to highlight those very voices, those very communities that will be in the forefront of this climate change battle. So we want to thank UMass team again for coming to us and offering this opportunity to actually begin that remediation process. So without further ado, I want to turn this over to back to, is it Caddy? Okay, no, not Caddy.
Thank you so much, David. Thank you for all of that context. And this is a very exciting report that we want to share. And the researchers are going to tell us all about what they found. And they'll tell us a little bit about the work that happened before, since this report is a follow-up on a previously published research report. So to start us off, I'd like to hand it over to Katsyris Rivera, if she is ready. Go ahead.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Katsyris Rivera. And I'm gonna be helping Dr. Watanabe to present this report, our second report in a volume subsequent the survey report. And the name is Voices That Matter, Views and Voices of Greater Boston Residents of Color on Climate Change. Next. So the Sustainable Solutions Lab did a strategic plan, and this was one of the key research ideas we wanted to start with. Next slide. We wanted to partner with community organizations and community members in order to find out what the perspectives on climate change were for different populations, especially Black, Indigenous, and people of color populations in Greater Boston. And so we are a team built by different disciplines, experts from different disciplines. Dr. Watanabe is a political scientist. Lorena Estrada-Martinez is a public health professional. And we based our research on doing things by ourselves and not doing this type of research without us. We wanted to do it ourselves as part of this BIPOC communities and researchers, and also creating opportunities for young researchers like myself, which I'm a Ph.D. student. And this has been a great opportunity for me to grow as a researcher and project management skills, etc. Now we can move to the next slide. So thank you again for joining us. We will give you a short glimpse of what the first report was. And you can find it in the website, in the CISL website, and we'll share in the chat some of the link. You can see it there for reference. So I'll guide you through some of the results from the survey component of this project. And next slide. The survey was administered as part of a statewide survey, also conducted by a third-party polling service provider from October 8th to November 9th of 2019. And it contains data from an oversample of residents from the greater Boston area, including Boston, Brookline, Cambridge, Chelsea, Everett, Lynn, Quincy, Revere, Somerville, and Winthrop. The oversample includes at least, the oversample includes at least 200 respondents from 4 racial ethnic groups, including Asian Americans, Black and African Americans, Latinos and Latinas, and whites. So given the geographic dispersion of Native Americans in the state, they were not included in the survey as they were more concentrated in greater Boston. And this is something that we address in the second report. Next slide. So the survey included topics on perceived ecological and health-related impacts, their seriousness and cause of climate change. We asked about levels of preparedness and policy support, among others. And then in the following slides, I'll show you a briefly the findings, the main findings from this first report on survey results. Next. So our results show that 87% of Greater Boston residents believe that climate change has been happening, regardless of race. Boston area residents believe that climate change is real. Next slide. We also asked people what they thought were the causes of climate change and found some differences across the board here. And where most Asian Americans and white residents believe that human activities alone were responsible, while majority of Black and Latino residents attributed to both humans and human activities and natural changes. Next. Then we started by asking people what they thought about the preparedness on their neighborhoods in general, and then about the region, neighborhoods, and families. When we asked about the ability of low and high income neighborhoods to withstand severe weather, most residents from all groups believe that high income neighborhoods are more prepared. And so Black and Latinos are more likely to indicate that high-income neighborhoods are very prepared than Asian Americans and whites. And the gap, as you can see here, the gap between being or not prepared becomes noticeably large when residents were withstand severe weather. And you can see that in the bottom section of this figure. Next slide. None of the groups felt strongly about their family, their neighborhood, or region being very prepared to withstand severe weather. However, this is where we found one of the starkest racial differences. As you can see in the first left column in red, very few Asian Americans perceive their families as very prepared to withstand severe weather. Black residents were more inclined to describe their region and neighborhoods as very prepared compared to other groups. And generally speaking, people felt more confident in their family's preparedness, except for Asians. Next slide. Despite the dissonance between groups' perceptions of family preparedness, respondents from all groups seemed to be acting upon specific components of emergency planning, such as having an evacuation plan, a place to store important documents, ensuring their homes, having enough food, medicine, and other essential supplies in stock, and a plan to get in touch with or meet with family in case of a weather emergency. So larger sections of each group had made specific preparations for emergencies, such as having an evacuation plan, a place to store documents. However, there were some difference between these actions. For example, the red column on the right shows that 74% of white residents compared with 57% of Blacks and 54% of Latinos and Asian Americans replied yes to having insured their homes and belongings. I would also like to point out the first two sky blue columns on the left, showing that less of half of Asian Americans and Blacks reporting having sufficient essential supplies in the face of a severe weather event. And now I will leave you with Dr. Watanabe, if we have him present.
Be happy to. So thank you all for being so indulgent. I'm now switched over to the Gaston Institute, my sister institute, to use their equipment. So here I am, and we're talking about now Voices That Matter, which is a follow-up to the Views That Matter study has been pointed out. And here's an opportunity to look at some of the voices of people from the four communities that we talked about, from the four major racial non-white communities in the greater Boston area, and see what they had to say about some of the issues that were raised in the survey. So let's move on to the next slide, please. The focus groups, so we had 8 virtual focus groups, and they had to be held virtually. We thought we could ultimately hold them in person, but because of the COVID-19 situation, we couldn't, and they were long delayed, and finally we decided to hold them virtually. There were 10 to 12 participants in each of the sessions, and there were sessions held. There were 2 sessions each held in the Asian American community, 2 in the Black community, and 2 in the Latino community, and a session held in the Native American community, which was critical to have because we did not have enough people to be able to survey them and for the survey portion of the study, but we felt it was critical to have the voices of Native Americans, and we did so through the focus groups. The UMass Boston Institutes and community partners worked together, the UMass Boston Racial and Ethnic Institutes. And I want to thank the people at the Institute for Asian American Studies, my institute, and the people at the Trotter and the Gaston and the Institute for New England Native American Studies for really taking the initiative in arranging for the focus groups, and usually with community partners were brought into the process as well. And we want to thank those as well. And the sessions were held in English, Spanish, and Cantonese, and these were the 3 languages that ultimately we utilized to have some of these in person. Okay, next slide, please. The focus group topics focused on 3 aspects that we're focused on as well in the survey, and they were the health impacts of climate change, as we talked about, climate change preparedness, and ways individuals and government can address climate change. These are 3 areas that have been pointed out by Katsyris so far, were discussed in the survey, in which we wanted to expand upon in the focus groups. And this is what our focus of our particular report is today. The report that was initiated focused on these 3 areas of the long discussions that took place within the focus groups. Next. In terms of preparedness for climate change, we focus principally on views that were presented by each of the communities. This is how we did the analysis. And on preparedness for climate change, the reason we did this is we saw some major racial differences in terms of preparedness for climate change. For example, as you saw, Asian Americans indicated the least likelihood of being prepared for climate change. We wanted to explore some of these reasons about why these differences exist. And then Chelsea, Asian female, for example, stated, and we'll have Katsy, I think, read the quotation.
Well, I can read them.
Okay, Gabriel.
I don't stock up on anything. I usually buy only when I need them.
And another Chinese person stated,
I don't have any assets in my house, so I don't buy it. Home insurance.
and finally, another Asian female stated,
No, how can we be prepared, especially those living in Chinatown? Shopping is so convenient. There's no reason to buy more things to stock up because shopping is so convenient.
so here the Asian American people really focused, in this case, people who lived in particularly in Chinatown area, who indicated that they didn't really feel that they had to be prepared for climate change because they couldn't prepare. Their houses were so small and they had so small assets, so why would they name home insurance? And how could they find room in their house or anything to stock up on excess water and so forth when they lived in small apartments? And even the notion that how can they need to be prepared because they lived in Chinatown and everything was so convenient gave them a false sense that these sorts of convenience is going to be available to them during the time of a crisis. So let's go on. And a Black American stated, a male said, there are certain things that we know that it's not just about me or just about you, it is about all of us. If we don't all work together to fight this and to turn it around or even to slow it down because we can't turn it around entirely, but to give ourselves time to hopefully put it in check, somehow it doesn't make any difference who you are, we are all going to feel the effects of this. The notion of preparedness for climate change is something that everybody has to work together on, that there's not going to be any winners and losers, is something suggested by Leah, sorry, a Black female, sorry. And the next quotation is from a Latina, as a Latino, and Gabriela will have her read it.
The news you see are so sad, especially in our countries, and that makes me very stressed. I say that if one day there is extreme weather, it should take me while sleeping, so I don't feel anything. And I just feel we should be more prepared.
So her clear reference point is not just what's happening in her neighborhood here in the United States, but what's happening far away in other countries from which many of these Latino immigrants come from. And that's a frame of reference that is often different for Latinos and other immigrants, as we're going to see, from those who are here within the United States, whose sense of neighborhood, a sense of comparison is with what's happening in their own neighborhood here in the United States and not what's happening perhaps in countries far away from which their notion of reference is what's happening in terms of how there's extreme weather and so forth is impacting them as they feel it here in the United States, even though it may be happening far away. And next. In the Native American female states, go ahead.
In our tribe, we're talking about how to prepare for many pandemics because things haven't gotten better with the environment. And so this is more of a pattern of how our life cycle is going to be.
And she goes on to state,
I got more networked with Native systems than I did before when relying on Western systems. And I also recognize that I've got that wonderful Native American lifeline kit.
So there is a sense in which this belonging to a larger group is going to help with the preparedness of these particular people in terms of the Native American population and their sense. It's an ongoing part of they see as a pattern of our life cycle. It's something that has to be prepared for and understood in those terms. And that they hope that they have this wonderful Native American lifeline kit as opposed to the Western systems is something to rely on in terms of Native systems. These are views that were brought forward by Native American presenters in some of our discussions, and we wanted to highlight some of them. Next. On the question of addressing climate change and its impacts, whether they be impacts that are felt specifically, as we asked, you remember we asked people if they thought the impact of climate change would be significant on populations, and many people stated that they thought it would be and that there would be increased so. in the future that already has been significant impact on health and so forth, and that are likely to be in the future. But these impacts were not specified in terms of the survey. And so one thing that the focus groups allowed people to do is specify what some of these specific impacts were. And Oscar, a black male, stated, I don't underestimate small beginnings. That's all I can say. I think it's important to begin somewhere. I think that's important for us to be accountable for our health and our well-being. It's also important for us to be accountable for our health. And it's also important for us to think collectively that little pieces fit together. If you look at some of the major public health that has existed, they all took time. It didn't take overnight to change. We still work on HIV and AIDS, and we still have the highest percentage of people of color who end up with AIDS still 35 years later. I think that we need to continue to do the work. I do think if we continue to help people understand how directly linked to their own survival these things are, that there will be change. You might not see it for a while, but there will be change. That's the kind of person I am. That's a value system. I believe that people change. This is a person who talks about the need for addressing this from the very beginning, and he talks about the experience of dealing with HIV and AIDS in the community and how 35 years later, they're still continuing to deal with these problems. And that persistence is what's going to be necessary to deal with the impact of climate change from his point of view. And that sort of persistence and that belief that if one continues to be focused on these issues, that's going to create a value system, as he says, that people will change is something that he believes is going to rely upon. And these sorts of the expressions were, to this extent, were given time and time again during our focus groups. So next. And Kate states something in another view. And Kate, Gabriella.
Just one more thing. If they could switch to, we've been talking about this idea of land as our family. If they could switch their idea of the extractive economy to understanding and treating land and water and our air as our family, that would completely change the way they make policies. It would completely change the way they do development. I mean, it would just turn everything upside down in a way that would be so positive. We can think really big that we have to change this whole relationship, the way that the government develops policies and thinks about development and water and land. If we can put something really big out there, then maybe we'll get something a little smaller. But one change, if they can make that one change, that would be huge.
So this is an interesting point of view by a Native American presenter who talks about the idea of one having to understand that treating land and water and air as our family is what's part of this response to climate change and its needs. And we have to change our way in which we think about development over time. And these are the sorts of changes that are called for by this Native American person in one of our focus groups. And then next. And Francis, a Native American, goes on to say.
I think one of the things that would be to really look at stuff in the long term. What needs to happen for different communities, for different constituencies, and not solely looking at value-based assets, like value dollar-based assets, because that tends to be how folks start looking at how you mitigate the loss of money, as opposed to the loss of land, the loss of opportunities, the loss of places for people who are low income to live. Really not looking at it in the traditional way that most governments do. Like, okay, I have a problem right in front of me. I'm going to think about that problem and I'm not going to think about anything else. That's not the way to go about doing it.
So this is another interesting perspective, in this case from a Native American female once again. So next. And another Asian female named Ivy, or we given a pseudonym name of Ivy.
I think it's natural for people to feel a responsibility for your own family first. However, I strongly feel that we as a neighborhood and community owe it to other people to help them out. I'm not talking about sheltering them. I'm talking about inclusive, all things. It includes racism as well, because if you really want to seek change, you have to be aware and active.
So this is a person calling for some collective response and collective understanding and need to embrace other people in terms of response to these climate change crises and others, and the need to challenge the notion of racism and be aware about the basis of racism, how it affects all these sorts of struggles for trying to deal with these sorts of conditions. It's a very wise counsel, I think, by Ivy. Okay, next. And in conclusion, there are certain themes and observations that emerge, and we want to just end by just summarizing some of our themes and observations that emerge from all of our discussions during the focus groups. And I'm going to let Katsy begin.
Paul, could you take the two conclusion slides?
Okay, so first of all, we found that the focus groups deepened our understanding of the perspectives of residents of color by exploring research rates in the survey in more detail, as I pointed out. For example, health impacts were generally mentioned where focus groups specified those health impacts in terms of asthma, respiratory conditions, stress, mental health impacts, etc. So the focus groups gave opportunity for people to be much more specific about those health impacts that were discussed in the survey. Immigrants of color saw their community as going beyond the confines of their city, town, or neighborhood in the greater Boston area to experience from their native lands. This was true for many immigrant residents. When talking about the impact of climate change, they often indicate consequences on a community larger than themselves and their families, to which they felt a personal attachment. This is a critical concept about what one thinks about the concept of community when they think about climate change. Was something that was also revealed in, I think, our discussions with these residents. Several residents also spoke about how geographic locations such as their home streets and neighborhoods, Chinatown, Mattapan, Roxbury, shaped their perception of issues and their impact. So here we go from the large outside to the smaller neighborhoods or even areas of the city within which they live as a frame of reference, and people talk meaningfully, for example, about Chinatown, and how because of the heat and so forth, it became a difficult area for people to live in with respiratory sicknesses. And Mattapan and Roxbury talk about heat areas, heat islands, and places where in the summer it got very hot and there's a lack of air conditioning and so forth in these areas, in these neighborhoods. And they spoke so from the larger sort of more international point of view, where some people spoke about lands far away, others spoke much more locally about their own neighborhood and their own part of the city. And we'll go on. And often the participants respond to inquiries about climate change with broader environmental concerns, indicating that residents of color are concerned about both ecological and community health beyond climate and change. In other words, many of them talked about climate change and environmental concerns in the same breath. In some ways, it became clear that they were sometimes talking about environmental concerns as opposed to simply climate change. But as we all know, the climate change and environmental concerns are linked. Environmental degradation contributes to climate change, and climate change contributes to environmental degradation. And then for a very better attention to some of the environmental needs are a way to combat and to think about climate change and its impacts. On several occasions, respondents of colors thought about the impact of climate change not only on human life, but on that of animals as well. This was something that we didn't expect, that in some ways they talked not just about the impact on climate change on people, but on the whole sort of ecosystem of human life and animal life and plant life and so forth, and thought about it in much more general terms than just focusing on human beings. Well, many residents spoke about how inequities, particularly wealth inequities, defined and often limited their ability to respond and prepare. Many of these residents generally did not seem paralyzed by the weight of these economic limitations when it came to taking initiatives and leading the way in addressing climate change challenges. In other words, many people who had experienced a great deal in terms of the inequities and the impact it had on other areas of their life, which we're finding out in various ways that those inequities are a foundation for much of the maladies that confront these communities and our general communities. Many did not seem paralyzed by it, the weight of these economic limitations. Indeed, they said that part of their resilience and their ability to withstand these things is something that is a real sort of resource that exists within these communities. Is going to help us out in sort of dealing with the future climate challenges, and we should understand it. And finally, some residents saw that poor communities often dealt with dire situations before and could call on their tenacity, knowledge, and resilience as assets. The damaging and unequal impact of climate change on communities of color is far from the first area in which those communities have had to rely on their abilities to respond to tragic circumstances. This is a notion that poor communities and the people that we talked about in our focus groups can be wise and reasonable in the way in which they perceive these challenges to our society. And they believe that their knowledge and tenacity and resilience is something that we should perceive as assets, that we should see these people not just as victims of climate change, but as people who help us to respond to these needs. And that's one of the wonderful things that I think emerged from our focus group discussions as well. Our appreciation of the individuals, these 60 to 70 something individuals who came before us, and were able to give us some insights into what it really means for them on the ground in these communities. And we want to thank them for doing so. Okay, I think that's sort of the end of our presentation, and we're going to take some questions from various individuals who might have them. But thank you very much for being willing to listen to us. And part of the reason why we spent so much time reading from the actual words and verbatim from the words is we really wanted to give them voice within this presentation. We didn't just want to talk about, say that we talked to them, but we wanted to bring to life some of their own words. And that's why we indulge us for a moment to allow us to listen to their voices in total. And that was what we tried to do in this presentation. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Paul, for this presentation, and we are going to move into a Q&A portion now. And to start us off, I have a question for you here. What are the implications of these results for policymakers?
Well, I think the implication, the general one, beyond any specific suggestions that were made about various ideas, I mean, the implications are that in some ways you bring a lot of scientists, a lot of people with PhDs to labs and so forth at universities, and they believe that they have the answers to these problems, and many of them do. But you have to have some understanding of what's happening to people on the ground and their own experience with these things, with these kinds of tragedies and other kinds of maladies as well, and challenges, and how they've responded to them. And the voice of those individuals is going to get better responses when the scientists and so forth ask them to do something. They're going to be more responsive to doing it if, in fact, they believe that they have some say in how to do it. And the particular conditions within a city. Many people look at a map of a city and say there's just people within the city. But people see that there are neighborhoods in different circumstances and live in different kinds of housing situations. Many of them have single-family homes and big yards, and many of them people live in small apartment buildings where they can barely turn around, and you have to go up many series of staircases to get up to their apartments. So this understanding is something that we think is critical, and we got it, I think, from talking to people, the focus groups. That it's not only about them, but we want to hear from them about what their situation is, and that's what we intended to do in this project. Hear from the voices of those who are supposedly most impacted by these concerns.
Thank you. I have a related question that I think you've started to touch upon, Paul. What do you see as next steps following from these insights? How can they be leveraged to influence policy and practices?
Well, the original idea behind the survey was to employ a baseline that would be continually utilized. And we noticed, for example, one of our partners in this Mass Inc. polling, which it was the one that actually did the polling for us in the first round. And they do a traditional fairly amount of surveying on climate change and other related issues. And I noticed in their last iteration of this activity, not only just in terms of our urging them to do so, but I think they in their own survey now is employing large numbers of efforts to try to use, for example, their surveying of populations of color in oversampling and so forth in their regular work. And this is the kind of thing that we encourage people to do. It takes time and energy and money, frankly, to do so, and it's hard to do so, but to do so will give us a clearer picture of what's happening when we look at these populations on the ground, and we make an effort when we do surveys and studies and so forth to take into consideration the views of those people that matter, as we call it in our project, the views of the people of non-white people within the greater Boston area and other areas.
Thank you so much. I'm really glad to hear that it's already had an effect on that company and how they do their polling. I think just to add a little personal touch here, what I love about both of these research projects is that there's this narrative out there that people of color don't care about this issue, and when you look at the results of your research, it's quite the opposite, and it really dispels this myth about who is affected and who cares. To share another question we have from the audience here, can you speak to some of the differences and similarities across communities of color and within communities about what needs to be done and who should address climate and environmental problems?
Well, some of the commonalities clearly were ones that were indicated at the beginning. That is that there's a general agreement that climate change is real. And a few years ago, that would not seem like a surprising, a surprising statistic to say that generally people pretty much agree now that climate change is something real. And yet there are some differences in terms of the sense about what are the causes of it. For example, Latinos and Blacks, for example, are almost equally divided in terms of understanding their belief that it's caused by human causes and by natural causes. Whereas Latinos and Asian Americans are much more like, Asian Americans and whites are much more likely to say that it's caused by human action and so forth. So there's some differences about the causes, but there's agreement about its impact. And there's agreement that it should be addressed and needs to be addressed fully. And there's some differences, as we pointed out, in terms of levels of preparedness. There's a sense of, for example, a perhaps surprising one that initially, at least, Asian Americans are the least likely to say that they feel that they are very prepared for various aspects of climate change. And yet, when you look at it deeply, you see that maybe on some of the specifics, there's general agreement across the board that there are certain areas like different groups are wanting in terms of having a plan, for example, or having having their material insured, et cetera, for what to do. And those differences have to be addressed as well. So you see a lot of differences and a lot of areas of overlap, and the level of concern that there is, a level of commitment that needs to be addressed is something that is expressed very clearly. One of the areas in which we did see some issues and which we did not really report in this report on was we asked the little experiment, we asked some people to respond to the issue of climate change and some people to respond to the issue of global warming, of global warming as a particular issue. And some of the people felt that it would be an interesting exercise to see if there might be a greater response to one another. So we asked people to prioritize various issues, including climate change and global warming, in terms of their concerns for their community. And pretty consistently amongst certain groups, particularly non-white groups, in particular Latinos and Blacks, they responded to believe that global warming was a much greater priority than the notion of climate change. That global warming sound much more important and much more serious in terms of, I don't know if it's a matter of translation or something, but clearly the idea of global warming was considered more of a dire concern than the notion of climate change for Latino populations in particular. And that was an interesting finding as well, and worthy of some look at why that might be the case. And in some of our discussions, it prompted some interesting discussions amongst the groups about why that might be the case.
That's a very surprising and interesting finding. When I was reading the report, something that stuck out to me too was how some of the advice that is given for resilience, climate resilience, generally, such as stocking up on, extra food and things like that. There were Asian participants that were talking about how that's not feasible for them for a few reasons. One being like, I can't afford to buy extra things that then could go bad if I don't use them within a certain amount of time. And secondly, as you were mentioning earlier, a lot of folks live in small spaces where one of the things they were bringing up was like, I literally don't have space in order to have all of these extra supplies in, like, I can't do that. So really sort of the mismatch between some of the general pushed strategies and then the reality of people's lives. So kind of following along from that and what you were just saying about how global warming is a term that people reacted to more, were there other findings in these focus groups that you found particularly surprising?
Well, I found in some respects the degree to which individuals sort of clearly reflected, as you said, the areas in which they lived in. For example, and it's not even just through our study, but the situation of people living in Chinatown in Boston, for example. I think a lot of people on the outside don't even understand there's a lot of people who live there, first of all. they think of it as largely, these small shops and restaurants, and don't really look behind and above and see that there are really people who live there. And those, therefore, when you build highways and you build large institutional structures, they contribute to bad air and bad congestion and so forth, which has an impact on those populations. And when the Boston Globe did a piece this summer on a Chinese woman trying to deal with the heat, the 100-degree heat that was in the city, and showed this picture of her having to lug these jugs of water up several flights of stairs up into her apartment in Chinatown. And in a Chinatown apartment where you could barely literally turn around in. This is the way the woman had to deal with the issue of heat, by having this cold water as much as she could, this water available to her in some ways. And the notion of air conditioning and so forth was something that was difficult to even imagine in this circumstance. And those sorts of understandings that these are the conditions under which a lot of our people are having to deal with environmental issues and climate change and so forth is an awakening, I think, to a lot of people. They say to themselves, well, in climate change, you're supposed to stock up on several days and months of food, for example. Well, if you don't have any room to even literally bring up a jug of water and put in your apartment for a couple of days, the idea of storing food and things for a long period of time is impossible to imagine. And these sorts of capacities are the kinds of things that I think there's been an indication of. And people in Roxbury talking, for example, about the notion that they can tell, they know that there are certain parts of the city that are particularly hot. They're hot spots during the summer, and they're aware of these spots. And they know the difficulty of getting air conditioning and why air conditioning is so critical to them and why it would make such a big difference in their lives if they did so. And all these sorts of things, I think, are clearly connected. And the discussions about food production, the impact on water and food production and so forth are quite sophisticated discussions about what the impact is of climate change and the various factors and environmental concerns that contribute to bad outcomes in terms of climate change, in terms of its impact on their communities. There's something that I think that provides some very telling and sophisticated and personal discussions about these impacts from these communities. So they're real resources. They're people who live on the ground with these realities, and they can educate us a lot about what the situation is in terms of that they face, often on a daily basis, given some sort of crisis.
Yeah, thank you, Paul. And I think we have one final question here for you. Do you think it would make a difference if more people from these groups were in decision-making and advocacy roles regarding environmental and climate change issues?
I do. As I said, as I think Katsyris must have said at the beginning, one of the principles that we try to bring to this research as a group of scholars is the notion that you want to have studies which are done about people of color by researchers who are people of color, or at least to some degree are people of color, because it adds a dimension of experience and knowledge and understanding that's critical to understand what's going on. And those voices are also necessary to have people who are policymakers and people who are bureaucrats who deal with these issues also from these communities, because they can have some sort of fundamental understanding of what's going on. It's not all about engineering, and it's not all about gizmos and so forth that can apply anywhere. So much of this has to be tailored to particular neighborhoods and experiences and so forth. And that understanding comes best from people who've lived and gone through these experiences. And so the extent to which we can encourage and have policymakers who deal with these issues on a daily basis, who have experienced in some respects these things in their own lives and their own families and their neighborhoods and countries from which they come, I think it only makes for better policy in the long run. And therefore, we as researchers want to urge researchers and students and others to get into this business that we're trying to focus on. And why we at UMass Boston and the Sustainable Solutions Lab have made a point that we want to be a center that really looks at the notion of inequities and notion of how that has the impacts it has on communities of color, and brings together researchers from various disciplines to be able to do that, and researchers, many of them who are from these communities, and I think it adds to it. And I must say, I missed the part where they had the introduction from David Moy and other people from the HIAMS and the Barr Foundation, but it also takes funders who understand this fundamental reality as well, about the need to empower communities of color and to draw upon the assets that they do to confront the problems of this day. In fact, as the country becomes a majority non-white country as well, they're going to have to provide these resources because they're going to be the majority in not only in terms of how these issues are dealt with, but who deals with them. And that's why it's critical for us to invest in these communities and understand the critical role that they can play.
Thank you so much, Paul.
Thank you for your help.
And so with that, I'm going to just share a little bit of information about, where you can get the report. I'm going to share my screen real quick, just contact information for all of us. Thank you to everybody who showed up today and who stayed with us, and for all of your great questions. You can find both of the reports at umb.edu/SSL/research. So Views That Matter is the first report. Voices That Matter is the follow-on focus group report. And on the screen, you can see all of our contact information. If you have other questions, you can feel free to contact us with this information here. And these slides and the recording will be available in the coming weeks. So once again, thanks everybody, and have a wonderful rest of your day.